It was a pivotal moment for me, my family, the world. And Gianna, she just don't know that the words that she spoke, my dad would change the world. He really did.
That's the brother of George Floyd reacting hours after the officer who killed Floyd, Derek Chauvin, was found guilty on all counts. You're looking at some of the most powerful images from Minneapolis yesterday and today, but right after that verdict was announced. And now that the entire country has had a day to process one of the most high-profile cases in history, the conversation is now shifting to where do we go from here as a nation, and how George Floyd truly did change the world. Shortly after the verdict was read, the Minneapolis Police Department's incident report from that day resurfaced, and it's interesting. We took that release at its surface value. If you looked at it the day of, surely there'd be no conviction and likely no charges against the officer. So let's take a closer look at some of it. The report itself says that Floyd physically resisted officers and that officers were able to get him into handcuffs before he appeared to start suffering medical distress. That's when, according to that report, officers called an ambulance, which brought Floyd to the hospital where he later died. That's the report. That's what police say happened that day. By now, we've all seen the video of what really happened. This is a still photo from that horrific video that has become seared in all of our minds, showing Chauvin's knee pinned on Floyd's neck for about 9 minutes. A very different story than from that police report. It was actually a teenager who started recording that video on her cell phone because she knew what she was watching was wrong. That video would go on to be seen by millions upon millions of people all across the world. It would reignite a national conversation about racial inequity, and it would spark new legislation on police reform. It would also lead to the first conviction of a police officer in the death of a black man in recent history. And just because a verdict has been reached and the jury has been dismissed, it doesn't mean the national conversation about George Floyd is over. Far from it. That video that was at the center of this trial has led Americans to face a cruel truth, and that's just the starting point in this conversation. Last summer, once people saw that harrowing video, millions of people from coast to coast marched in the wake of Floyd's death. The calls for equality were heard from Minneapolis to San Francisco, New York, and here in Boston. At times, the anger in America was visible with violent protest, and at other times it was silent with those sit-ins. Even today, more peaceful marches were held in the Boston area, but this time the calls are to keep demanding change. For the people who witnessed the death of George Floyd in person, some of those emotions are as raw as ever, even almost a full year later. Donald Williams happened to be walking by the moment officers handcuffed George Floyd. He spoke today about the emotional toll this case has taken on him leading up to yesterday's verdict.
A sigh of relief off my shoulders, like there's a lot of weight on my shoulders, and for me, myself, and my kids and my family, it was just relief, to hear that the verdict came down the way it did. And I wouldn't say joy because it's a lot of work still to be done, but it was a lot of relief off of my shoulders.
Even for those who weren't in Minneapolis that day, the past 11 months have brought a wide range of emotions: anger, fear, sadness, anxiety. It's a lot to deal with. And the horrific images of Floyd's final moments have resonated in all of our minds. Psychologist Dr. Charmaine Jackson says it was a traumatic experience for a lot of people who saw that video, especially for members of the black community, and especially the past few weeks, seeing it over and over again during the trial.
Many of us are not related to George Floyd in any way. We're here in Boston, and we feel the impact of his death as if it were a family member. People of color, Black folks in particular, have hope, right? There is, we would not be still here if we didn't have hope and a possibility that things will change.
It's that hope that's led people to protest in the name of George Floyd almost every day for like a full year now. The hope that the police officer is convicted in the death of a black man isn't considered rare anymore. And the hope that this guilty verdict isn't the end, but rather the start of broader systemic change.
It should be the beginning of this nation figuring out that we all can live with each other. We all should be able to work together. People really believe that we have freedom, and it's freedom for all since justice was served for George.
After Floyd's death, there was some change on the state and local level, really across the U.S. Here in Boston, the city created a citizen review board to provide oversight of Boston police. In Connecticut, they passed a police reform law to increase accountability for law enforcement. And now with Chauvin's conviction, more attention turning to what's being done at the federal level. Less than 24 hours after that verdict was read, Attorney General Merrick Garland today announced the Justice Department is launching a civil rights investigation into the Minneapolis Police Department. This probe will include a comprehensive review of the police department's policies, their training, the supervision, and the use of force, even accountability.
If the Justice Department concludes that there is reasonable cause to believe there is a pattern or practice of unconstitutional or unlawful policing, we will issue a public report of our conclusions. Building trust between community and law enforcement will take time and effort by all of us. But we undertake this task with determination and urgency, knowing that change cannot wait.
Also important to remember, last year, the Trump administration actually opened a federal criminal investigation into the case just days after Floyd died. That criminal investigation is ongoing. They'll run side by side with the civil rights violation investigation. And that's not all that's in the works in Washington right now. A police reform bill, which previously passed the House, is currently still stalled in the Senate. The George Floyd Justice in Policing Act was introduced by Democrats, and it looks to reshape police training in this country by banning things like chokeholds, even issuing a national police misconduct registry, among other things. After the verdict was announced, Floyd's family members emphasized the importance of the Senate passing this reform measure.
We think about the George Floyd Policing Act. That is something that a bill that needs to be set on higher standards, on the grounds. It needs to be at a top tier because you have so many people who have their blood on that bill.
So the trial of Derek Chauvin centered around that horrific video of the murder, but maybe it'll be the video of Chauvin being walked away in handcuffs in that courtroom that's the new lasting image that leads to overall change. Because it's not only uncommon that police officers are convicted in a civilian's death, but it's also rare that officers are even charged. We all know the case of Breonna Taylor, who was shot and killed inside her apartment last year when police issued a no-knock warrant. None of those officers are facing charges. Or the death of Eric Garner, whose last moments, like Floyd's, were captured on video. He was placed in a chokehold by police on Staten Island back in 2014. Gardner was heard nearly a dozen times telling police that he couldn't breathe. But the officers in that case were never indicted by a grand jury. Or the deadly shooting of 18-year-old Michael Brown at the hands of a police officer in Ferguson, Missouri. That incident caused widespread outrage and weeks of protest, even riots in some cases. The officer who shot Brown was eventually cleared. Those are just some of the deadly shootings of black people at the hands of police officers that have gone without a day in court. And it begs the question as to whether now, why now, is really the right time we could be seeing systemic change. President Biden, who evoked Floyd's dying words last night while addressing the nation, says now is the time that has to have change.
I can't breathe. We can't let those words die with him. This can be a giant step forward in the march toward justice in America.
And the American people will once again be watching closely in about 8 weeks when Chauvin is expected to be sentenced by the judge. Now, we don't know exactly how much prison time he could get, but here's what we do know. The most serious charge he was convicted of was that second-degree unintentional murder charge, the felony murder charge. It carries a maximum of 40 years in prison. But we also know the state of Minnesota generally recommends lesser sentences for first-time offenders like Chauvin, who are convicted of murder, which is about 12 and a half years. But in this case, the state already pushing for a tougher sentence than that 12 and a half. Ultimately, though, this will be up to the judge. Chauvin right now being held in a segregated unit of a Minnesota state prison about 25 miles outside of Minneapolis as he awaits that sentencing. That was the new mugshot just released by the Department of Corrections. And that sentencing could happen sometime in mid-June. Also later in the summer, the 3 other former Minneapolis police officers connected to Floyd's death will be on trial. Alex Kang, Thomas Lane, and Tao To are each charged with aiding and abetting second-degree murder, as well as second-degree manslaughter, one of the charges that Chauvin was found guilty of. At a hearing next month, the state is expected to try and even add a third-degree murder charge for Tao, Lane, and Kung. The trial for those former officers is slated to start on August 23rd. So by this summer, especially when that trial gets done, this case will be closed, but the impact will surely live on. And as Congress debates the sweeping legislation and state laws change and federal investigations get underway, it's important not to forget where we started with this police report. Police initially tried to tell everyone George Floyd died of medical distress and that the officers on scene called for help. But that video clearly showed otherwise. And the jury in Chauvin's case only needed 10 hours to convict him. Clearly, the perception of what happened in that incident from that police report to the video to the conviction yesterday has changed an awful lot in 11 months. It'll be interesting to see in the months ahead how much the perception of policing in America and the legislation that potentially gets passed in this changes as well.